Welcome back to the show. This is Open Mic on WJR, and we are pleased to be joined by a couple Sportscaster.com contributors to talk about the NBA Superteam. Is that era of basketball over? We have different opinions on this. Brendan Mato, senior at Detroit Catholic Central High School, and Gabe Loper, junior at Wayne State University. Fellas, welcome to the show. All right, so let's get into it, fellas, because if you're watching the conference finals at this point, there's some fresh blood, which is fun. It's exciting. I cover the NBA year round, so I like to see different teams get involved. And as we've seen, obviously, the teams with the best record in the regular season, it matters little unless you're Oklahoma City. But outside of the Thunder, who was my pick to win it all, when you look at the teams that are still alive, right, with the Thunder, the Timberwolves, Pacers, and Knicks, there's some exciting brand of basketball to watch. And I think what we want to hammer home is the fact that, this will be the seventh straight year where there will be a new NBA champion crowned, right? And so that begs the question. We'll start with you, Gabe, because I know you've got a thought on this. Is the era of the super team officially over?
It's a good question. And, like you said, with, the amount of parity that we've had in the league over the last, 7 years, yeah, it begs the question. But, in terms of is it over, I don't think so. And it's for, several reasons, but I think it might be on pause for now. But I mean, as long as, cap in the NBA, salary cap is, as long as that's still a myth, basically, because teams reconstruct their deals and players take cuts and whatever. But as long as that's still a thing, and as long as players want to play each other or play with each other, I think it's on pause. I don't think it'll ever be over.
I like that, on pause. And look, I think maybe it's fodder, right? I mean, it's worth talking about. But I mean, it wasn't that long ago Golden State won 3 or 4. You know what I mean? And then they won another one here in the years since. And I know you being you having an appreciation for this West Coast team, Golden State. Not a bad place to play if you like San Francisco. All right, I want to have you before we go back to Gabe. I want to hear from you, Brendan. When you look at it, I kind of like what Gabe said. He feels like it's just on pause. We're just maybe in a period of time where we are seeing some of that parity and other teams are getting a shot.
Yeah, that he makes a good point. I think it's on pause. Like what I would say more so is like as guys try to become involved in their own brand more, like we see this the most recent like apparent example I'd say would be like Kyrie Irving leaving the Cavs. He wants to do his own thing, and you think of at least when I think of the NBA teams still in the playoffs now competing for the finals, they kind of got like that staple guy, like the Timberwolves, it's Ant, right? It's the Pacers, it's Halliburton. But I like what Gabe was saying, as salary cap is still kind of a myth, right? And it's just monetary fees that are the issue for going over the luxury. Like these GMs and owners with deep pockets are just going to pay the fee. So are super teams still possible? Yes. But I think the era where super teams are the formula isn't necessarily um, around anymore with like, how the NBA looks right now, and especially the conference finals look right now. So
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I like that. I like that about the formula. I look at the teams will try to do it. I guess first of all, you'd have to decide what your criteria is for super team, right? So I mean, is that 2 all NBA guys on a team? Is that 3 all stars? Is that a big 3? Is it like if you look at the New York Knicks right now and you say Brunson and Towns, they've got some really nice supporting cast around it, right? But is that because they only have 2 of 3? Is that not a super team? I think the other thing I'll say is with Giannis, okay, in Milwaukee, right? They won 1 championship while he's been there. The question is, if you have an elite NBA caliber player like Giannis, and if you don't get it done, if you don't win multiple titles, is that considered disappointing? You know what I mean? Did they underperform with what they had? And where does Giannis land this offseason? Is he playing in Milwaukee? I see over there, Gabe? Is there any chance he
You
goes
know,
back to
I think
Milwaukee?
every player, deep down wants to go back to their, the team that they started with and won their first championship with. But at the same time, players do want to win championships, and if that championship is with, Jimmy Butler, Steph Curry, and my Golden State Warriors, then by all means. But kind of going back to the point where you said earlier, where we got to make sure that we have our definition of super team correct. I mean, I look at the Warriors in 2015, 2016. Yeah, it was a great roster, but you got to think that most of that roster was homegrown. Where you had, they drafted
Yeah.
Steph Curry, they drafted Klay Thompson, they drafted Draymond Green. They picked up Andre Iguodala, but the three main stars that we look at on that 2015, that 2016 team was, those were all stars and stuff that they drafted over time, and eventually kind of turned into a super team. Which not all dynasties are super teams, and not all super teams become dynasties, as we saw with the Brooklyn Nets a few years ago. I don't consider, despite how great Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, and Dennis Rodman were, I don't consider them to be, you know, one of those super teams, whatever. That's kind of put together. Yeah, I
Right.
mean, I think you could make a case in 2017 with the Warriors that became a super team, with the addition of Kevin Durant, because it's, kind of went outside of that homegrown nature. But I think there's a stark difference there. And when you're looking at these things and we're analyzing, is it over? That idea of a star going to join another star. I think that element is so important when when analyzing this.
Yeah, I like that point. I was thinking about that. Like, kind of, a super team could be like Gabe said, it's homegrown. They get young guys that start going off, getting ridiculous in the league, and that it could become a super team. It doesn't necessarily mean that you got to have two MVP candidates and you're paying them the big bucks, right? So it's kind of the thing, like Minnesota gets some young guys to start going crazy on their younger contracts. You don't need to get close, like breaking the salary cap with a Kevin Durant and a Steph Curry.
Yeah, look, I think, especially when we come a little bit closer to home and talking about the Detroit Pistons, which is a team I get to watch on any given night. That's largely a homegrown roster, right? And when you're picking in the top five several years in a row and you finally get a one of one, and Cade Cunningham is the franchise guy and takes a leap forward like he did this year, you start looking at all the first round picks they've hit on over the last several drafts. And obviously, because of what they did this season, they don't have a first or don't have a lottery pick this year, but they've hit on the majority of their guys and then brought in a couple of the guys, veterans in free agency, which has made them a competitive team. I think that's the interesting part, as you guys brought up, is, how do we define super team and then how do you define dynasty? So if you look at Jordan's dynasty of the Bulls winning 6 and 8 years, was that a super team? Maybe not by how most people would describe what a modern day super team is. Like the Celtics and Lakers in the 1980s. Were those super teams or were they just dynasties? So I think GMs, fans, people want to play for dynasties. And I think you could make the case, Gabe. I know you love the Warriors with Curry and obviously with adding Durant, um, helped them secure what was a dynasty. I think Tim Duncan Spurs, they had some other great pieces. Were they a super team? I don't know, but I think you could say the Spurs were a dynasty. The Lakers with Kobe and Shaq, was that a dynasty? I mean, there have been some pockets of dynasties. And I don't want to overuse that word either, just because you had good teams that won multiple titles. But as far as the construction of quote unquote super team, um, I think if you ask most guys, yeah, I mean, you want to play with your friends, but do you want to play on a dynasty where you're going to win titles? And I think that's what most guys are chasing.
Even then, if I think we see a lot of young guys, we see kind of like the turning of the tide between the LeBron, Steph, Durant era players, the Kyrie Irvings, that generation. I think as they go on and that this new generation kind of kicks in a little bit, I think you're going to see players like Anthony Edwards, wanting to team up with another young guy, whether it be like a guy like Brunson or a guy like Cade Cunningham, even in Detroit, where you start seeing these guys that were drafted by teams and are on these lowered contracts and stuff. Now, as those contracts expires, you know, who's to say that Cade doesn't want to bring another guy in his era to Detroit, and then vice versa. So I
Mm-hmm.
think with what I said earlier, with this era being on pause, we're gonna see some of these guys like Halliburton, want to play on teams with other great guys that they've since competed against. So kind of like what we saw with Durant and Steph Curry with after that Western Conference Finals in 2016. Durant blows 3-1 lead. You know what? I'm gonna go play with Steph. So
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to mention too is like Johnny, you were talking about dynasties and super teams and how it's not all dynasties are super teams. I think it can go both ways. Not all super teams, right? Obviously, are going to have success. Like there's a super
Right.
team on paper. Like you, you look at Kawhi Leonard and Paul George on the same Clippers roster, and you're like, oh my God, like winning formula. And whether it be injuries or you know all this other stuff, whatever, they didn't produce. And same thing with the Nets back in the day, like Kyrie Irving,
For sure.
James Harden, Kevin Durant. I mean, that is like you look at that on paper and you have to think, oh, they're going to be competing for a championship, and they didn't. So I think it's kind of a two-way street. You can have what seems to be the golden key, and it just doesn't work.
Right. No, I think no, and I think that's kind of what spurs on the discussion is like on paper, what is a super team? And you're like, well, because he's all NBA, he's an MVP candidate. Like, look at the big three, with Bosh and Wade and LeBron down in Miami. Situation set up nicely. It's a super team. Coach Spo, not one, not two, not three, not four, and I was like, right, none of that, because it was a super team that didn't become a dynasty. So I think that's where people would say, okay, are we just constructing these, pieces that don't necessarily fit? Like we can win with just three headline guys. And then, you know what? To heck with the rest of the roster. I think the formula, what we've seen here more recently is like, look, from top to bottom, I just feel like, well, my favorite team to watch, you already know. Because I just like the way that the Pistons are constructed. And if you look at them, they are mostly homegrown. And when you have the control and the continuity from, execs coaching on down, and you follow that similar vision, you can take these steps of progression of getting to where they are going to go, right? So you go from being, worst team in the NBA, giant leap forward. Now you're the sixth team in the East. Can you continue to progress? Now they're going to have to add, right? Are they good enough to beat a team like Indiana, Boston, Cleveland, New York? Obviously not right now, but I feel like they've got a young enough core in place, and they are homegrown, built from within largely, that I feel like that's a type of team that can sustain success. And they've got a franchise guy in Cade Cunningham.
Yeah, and there's intangibles involved with that too. Like you get a free agent just to go to New York or go to Golden State, and he's just going to play basketball. But these homegrown guys, that's part of the deal. They love the city, they love where they're at, they love the jersey that they wear. And I think that's something valuable. What it might not win them 10 more games, but it might win them a couple more.
Yeah. Well, I think, and one last thing that I'll say is, and this is maybe getting off it a little bit, but there are different types of athletes. There are different types of players, and some guys will chase championships. Some guys will chase numbers. Some guys will just chase the bag. And so when you have a player that says, I want to play here, I want to be here, I want to bring championships to this city, a city that has championship pedigree, I think that means everything. And sometimes when you're constructing, when other cities or other franchises, go about constructing a super team, it doesn't always jive with what is needed, just because you say, well, statistically, I think these three guys, hey, we'll figure it out. Put them on the floor together. We'll figure it out. We'll go win games. The NBA is more nuanced than that. There's an enjoyable brand that I like watching. And I do feel like when you've got a guy who is selected to play there, and when you are able to extend him and say, you will be our franchise guy, and he says, I'm playing not just for me, but I'm playing for my city. That to me is that's everything for me as a fan watching. And I feel like Steph Curry is that to Golden State. And I grew up in the state of Ohio, and it was like when, LeBron, I remember when the decision came and it was like, how could you leave? It's like, well, what is loyalty? You know what I mean? Like, are you going to be able to put enough pieces around me? Like you could say this too. I'll go back to that decision, was like a lot of people that felt spurned when LeBron initially left Cleveland, right, to go to Miami. And then obviously he would ultimately return. But it's like, if the front office or the people that you're counting on to put the best people around you, and you can't win a title in that window and you say, hey, I'm going to go chase a championship. I didn't necessarily blame him for leaving, but there are some that still, he'll never be forgiven. You know what I mean? Like, where is your loyalty at that point?
I mean, the idea of like, the big money decision of a guy, a superstar, going to a team that's already pretty well crafted, and a team that kind of needed that one more piece that you were talking about, with a pretty much homegrown team for the most part, kind of, give or take. Um, the idea of a superstar and the decision, something that we haven't seen really before. Um, you know, and go like leaving your home team to go to a team for one goal of winning a title with other superstars. Kickstarted the era.
That was it. I mean, look, I remember when I was sitting there, it was 2010. So yeah, 15 years ago, basically. And he gets up there with Jim Gray and that really did kickstart it. Right. And I think, hey, if we're being honest, and now we're going to pin all the blame on LeBron, but that's kind of where I think that became part of our nomenclature, was like super team. Right. Now, if they would have gone and won, say, 4 or 5 straight championships, maybe we're not having this discussion. But it didn't bear out the way that they had expected. And then, as we mentioned, teams like Brooklyn, Philly, you start to, these other teams that have gone out and tried to do the same thing with very limited success. So, all right, boys, it's a discussion worth having. Appreciate having you on. Gabe Loper from Wayne State University and Brendan Mato from Detroit CC. Appreciate having you guys on. Appreciate all our guests on this week's show. We got to meet the two men behind the mask of Sparty at Michigan State University. We also laid out the MHSAA state baseball playoffs, and we got into our discussion of the NBA Superteam era. Our thanks to all our guests, and we look forward to seeing you again next week here on Sportscaster.com's Open Mic on WJR.